It's really tempting to actually just wear this for Halloween. I've been procrastinating filming this for like 3 days now, just because I'm really nervous about doing this makeup look. Anywho, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Hazel Jane, and I paint crap on my face. I have started the video like this, which can only mean one thing. I'm talking myths, I'm talking monsters, and makeup. We are back with another spooky season special of Monsters, Myths and Makeup, which is just this little series I have on my channel where I do makeup based on a particular monster or myth or legend, and whilst doing said makeup, I talk about the history and the lore and the backstory of said myth or monster. Last week we looked at... what the hell did I talk about last week? Haunted, creepy ass dolls. We were looking at the history of some of the real life cases of haunted dolls and all that spooky dooky stuff. Also in my last video I asked you guys about like your preference for sort of video length and how much depth you wanted me to go into with my research, and it was basically just overwhelmingly everyone saying longer videos, deep dive, more backstory, more tangents. So this is on you guys now. So today we are looking at another piece of Irish folklore that I've wanted to do since I did my banshee video, and it has actually also been quite a highly requested video for me to do as well. So today we are looking at the legend surrounding the Headless Horseman. Horseman? Horsemen. Horseman. Men? The Headless Riders on horses. I have a fairly ambitious makeup look to do for this one, which I'll be honest, I've never done before, so I'm scared, but I've got a lot to talk about, so let me go get prepped and then we can get started. For those of you who are interested in the makeup side of things, I will link all of the products that I use in the description box down below. So who or what is a Headless Horseman? So I think for most people, myself included, when you think of a Headless Horseman, you think of Sleepy Hollow, or the legend of Sleepy Hollow, and it's a headless rider on a black horse, sometimes carrying like a pumpkin for a head. But the actual origins of the Headless Horseman are so much older than that. Unfortunately, because I have to do this element of the makeup kind of first, it's going to ruin my expression for the rest of the video, so apologies. Oh god, it's so much worse when I smile. So the Headless Horseman is not like a single figure within mythology or an individual like character, as a lot of people seem to think it is. So it's actually considered an archetype, like a blueprint of a mythical figure that has appeared in folklore throughout Europe since the Middle Ages, generally depicted as riders on horseback who have no head. So the legend of Sleepy Hollow is probably the most sort of well-known example of the Headless Horseman, and it is usually the one that people think of when they hear the phrase. But the story of the Headless Horseman, obviously based on the short story published in 1820, the inspiration for that came from the original European folklore. Now, because the legend of the Headless Horseman is found across so many different cultures and different countries, the legend of each one obviously varies slightly in origin and just general story. And don't worry, I will be covering a lot of them, but probably the most well-known, and I think what a lot of people consider to be the like original version, is from Irish folklore, which is known as the Dullahan. Now, I mentioned the Dullahan very briefly in my video on the Banshees, mainly because of the connection that it has to the Death Coach, which obviously the Banshees have a connection to as well. But generally speaking, the Dullahan is pictured as a headless rider on a black horse, or as a coachman, either with like just no head at all, or carrying it under his arm, or sometimes like under his leg. So if you have seen the Banshee video, do you remember I spoke about the Bunworth Banshee to do with like Reverend Bunworth? It was written about in a book called Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland, and it turns out that the author, a guy called Thomas Crofton Croker, was actually like the great-grandson of Reverend Bunworth, so the story was a bit like, Turns out Mr. Croker also wrote about the Dullahan in that book, as well as honestly quite a lot of just very well-known Irish mythology and like folklore in general. But first little fun side note of the video, because Mr. Croker was a bit of a controversial man with regards to his work, and it's kind of wild. Basically, he used to do loads of like field trips and just general sort of research, and he would like travel around collecting tales and traditions from Irish people just all over the place. And during his life he released quite a few books, but the Fairy Legends book is the most well known. But when he was writing the book, or like planning for it, he actually lost all of the like manuscript notes that he had for it, so he had to basically reconstruct the whole thing with the help of like a bunch of other writers and people that he knew. But a lot of the people that helped him basically felt that he didn't acknowledge their help at all within the book, and there was a whole big thing about it. But basically a lot of people accused him of like taking other people's stories and then just publishing them under his own name. So as useful as he was for my research into Irish folklore, he's basically just like the Irish version of Gilderoy Lockhart. Croker was also actually accused of being of Anglo-Irish descent rather than like just pure Irish descent, and he was really heavily criticised for his like portrayal of Irish history and Irish traditions, because people often felt that he put like a very sort of comical distortion on them almost, and he generally wrote about them in quite a patronising way. He embellished his stories quite a lot as well, and people found that he wasn't like super true to the traditions and the history because he added a lot of sort of literary embellishments to it. Despite that though, his work was really successful, and especially the Fairy Legends book, which was apparently instrumental in attracting a wider audience to Irish folklore beyond like the English speaking world. The first part of this work was actually published in 1824 and was then translated into German by the brothers Grimm, who are obviously two of the most well-known storytellers of folk tales and just folklore publishers. So yes, Thomas Croker, very, very influential, if not controversial little man. And I say little because he was 4'10". Now within his Fairy Legends book, Croker obviously talks about the Dullahan, and I believe it's one of the earliest written sort of like visual descriptions of the Dullahan. And I'm going to apologise in advance because he described it as such a head no mortal ever saw before. It looked like a large cream cheese hung round with black puddings. No speck of colour enlivened the ashy paleness of the depressed features. The skin lay stretched over the unearthly surface, almost like the parchment head of a drum. Two fiery eyes of prodigious circumference, with a strange and irregular motion, flashed like meteors. According to more modern storytellers, the Dullahan had a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. Said mouth of razor-sharp teeth forms a grin that basically goes from like ear to ear, and it has these massive eyes that just constantly like dart round, and it's also described that the flesh has acquired the smell, colour and texture of mouldy cheese, which is just vile. So, what is the deal with the Dullahan? So, similar to banshees, the Dullahan is considered a dark fairy or dark fae creature, otherwise known as an unseelie fairy, and he's again considered a sort of omen or predictor of death. But unlike the banshees, it is often believed that the Dullahan has a bit more of a hands-on approach, in that he is actively looking for souls to take with him to the afterlife, and the whole like face-splitting, ear-to-ear grin is sort of representative of the joy that he finds in taking the lives of others. Now, he can appear as a horseman, or he can appear as a coachman driving a horse-drawn carriage. And he's usually spotted, like, driving out of a graveyard, and then he makes his way through towns and villages after dark. It's said that he can only speak once on his journey, and that is to basically say the name of the person that he has chosen to take with him to die. And once that name is called, the person's soul is called to death, and there is nothing that can be done about it. Now, going back to the whole death coach thing for a second as well, because obviously I know I covered it a little bit in the Banshee video, but the coach itself is endlessly fascinating. It is referred to by like a number of different names. So you have the death coach, sometimes it's referred to as the silent coach. I saw it referred to as the death coach because of the fact that it's silent, but in other cases it's known as the headless coach, which is then driven by the Dullahan. Now, Mr. Croker also wrote about the death coach, and again provided a very vivid description for it, which, whilst terrifying and horrible, I can't lie, it's kind of badass. So the axle of the carriage is made from a human spine. The spokes on the wheels are all human thigh bones, and later writings added additional details like the fact that there are 2 hollow skulls that hang from the carriage like lanterns that are then set with candles. And the hammercloth, which is this big, like, elaborate decorative piece of fabric that covers like the coachman's seat, it's usually really, really ornate and overly embellished, is made of a really pale material, damp with like mildew and being chewed away by worms. And in other places I saw it described as basically the hammercloth was made of like dried, stretched out human skin. It's believed as well that the death coach is drawn by 6 headless black horses, and it travelled so fast that flames and fire would come out of their nostrils and from their hooves when it like hit the ground. Although I've just realised I don't know how flame comes out of their nostrils if they have no head. Maybe if they do have a head, the flames come out, and if it's not, then it's the hooves. But yeah, basically the coach travelled so fast it was known to like set bushes on fire at the side of the road as it passed. And the belief also went that as the horsemen and the carriage travelled through the village or the town or wherever they were going, any locks on the doors or the gates of homes would automatically open, basically kind of signalling that there was no getting away from him, there was no escaping him. From my previous video on Irish folklore, obviously the death coach is representative of the inevitability of death, because the belief is that once it comes to Earth, it cannot return empty, and once someone has been sort of marked for death by it, there is nothing that mortal beings can do to change that. Again, similar to the horseman. There is also another element of the belief that I didn't know about, and this is in relation to both the carriage and just the horseman himself, and it's that if you opened your door as the coach or the horseman was going by, you would end up with like buckets of blood being splashed over you, or you'd be blinded. Which, to be fair, I'm pretty sure if you had a bucket of blood splashed over you, you wouldn't really be able to see anything anyway. However, if you were lucky, you would carry gold somewhere on your person, as it was believed that the sight of gold would send the Dullahan back to the depths of darkness from where he came. I couldn't find too much about like why gold is meant to send him away, because he's representative of like the inevitability of death and that kind of thing, but I don't know whether it's like a fairy thing, like a fairies in general, or certain types of fairies, they don't like gold. I don't know if it's specific to him. Like I said, I couldn't really find too much about that aspect. It was just accepted that gold would protect you from him. Now, going back to dear old Mr. Croker for a second, one of his stories that involved the Dullahan was called Hanlon's Mill. Basically, in this story, there is a man called Mick who is travelling back to the estate that he works on, and on his journey he sees a black coach being drawn by 6 headless black horses, driven by a headless coachman wearing black. Now, Mick, beyond the fact that all 6 horses and the driver had no head, the main thing that he remarked was that the coach and the horses in the ride, they made absolutely no sound. Even though they were going past them like insanely fast, there was no noise that came from it whatsoever. But he just writes it off. But the next morning, Mick receives news that the lord of the estate, like the master of the estate that he worked on, despite being in perfect health the previous day, had very suddenly had a fit and then died. Now, the Dullahan is believed to go out searching for souls to take with him to the afterlife, but there's a number of quite interesting theories regarding the Dullahan's ability to see, because some modern interpretations have it that the Dullahan has the ability to see with his severed head, which he basically holds up almost like a lantern and uses it to like scan the countryside for victims, like some kind of weird, freaky periscope. However, in another one of Croker's tales, known as The Harvest Dinner, the headless coach is described as a blind thief, and Croker assumes that he can't see or lacks sight because he lacks a head. Which, I mean, it makes sense. Another note regarding the Dullahan's sight, or potential lack of sight, you will often see the Dullahan depicted as using a human spine as a whip. Now, this additional detail comes from more modern interpretations from like around the 21st century, whereas in Croker's original tales, the Dullahan is described as just bearing a long whip. But in the Harvest Dinner tale, he strikes the horses with the whip so hard that he almost strikes a witness in the eye, which nearly blinds them. And Croker worked out from that the horseman, just purely out of habit, attempts to destroy the eyes of anyone who sees him. Croker's reasoning for this in particular was basically that the horseman was jealous in that his wrath would turn to these onlookers because they had the ability to be onlookers, whereas he didn't because he didn't have a head, so he couldn't look. Now, whether it is jealousy over witnesses' ability to see him, or more in keeping that he just didn't want them to see him, I don't know, but I did find several references to this behaviour of like blinding witnesses, and I'll be honest, of the two, I think it is more likely that it's he's just blinding witnesses so they can't see what he's doing because it's all spooky and mysterious, rather than he's jealous that they have eyes. Now, before we jump into the origins of the Irish Dullahan, I meant to say at the beginning of the video, so I'm going to just say it now. I apologise in advance for every single pronunciation that I am going to attempt for the rest of this video. We're talking Irish, like ancient and old Irish, Scottish, Welsh, like there's a lot of words that I am definitely going to get wrong. I will try my best, but just on the whole, I am very, very sorry. Please do feel free to correct me in the comments on any of the pronunciations because I do genuinely try to get them right. Now, the origins of the Irish Dullahan specifically is very interesting because there are many who believe he is the embodiment of an ancient Celtic god known as Crom Dubh, meaning black crooked one or dark bent one, who was in turn based on the god Crom Cruach, which was a pagan god from pre-Christian Ireland. Now, according to Christian writers, so immediately take that with a pinch of salt, this particular god was worshipped through the form of human sacrifice in exchange for like milk and grains, which suggested that he may have had some kind of function as like almost a fertility god, but the practice of worshipping him was ended by St. Patrick. Now, the description of this god is of a gold figure surrounded by 12 bronze or stone figures, and it's been interpreted by some people to represent like the sun being then surrounded by the signs of the zodiac, which could suggest that Crom also had some kind of function as a solar deity as well. Now, the method of human sacrifice that this particular god demanded was, can you guess? It was decapitation. Now, it was during the 6th century when Christianity came over to Ireland and started to gain in popularity that these like ritualistic sacrifices and worship of the god were condemned and then stopped. And it was around this time that the story of the Dullahan first started kind of becoming a bit more common, as it was believed that Crom Dubh had taken the physical form of the Headless Horseman in order to continue getting the sacrifices that he called for. I'm really hoping this comes together, because right now this is looking like a hot mess. I actually have an interesting little side note about decapitation or headlessness. The ancient Celtics believed that the soul was like in the head, so if during a battle you came across a foe and said foe was a worthy foe, you would then take their head to add to your prestige. From my understanding is similar to like, you know, the Dothraki braids in like Game of Thrones. It's basically like a trophy. But there was also a belief that if you attached the head to a pole near your home, the head would then scream when the enemy got near. Now, if you go over to Scotland, the most prominent tale of a headless horseman is that of a ghost rather than a fairy, or unseelie fairy, and it is a ghost of a man named Ewan who haunts the roads of a place called Mull. I think it's pronounced Mull. Mull? Now, the tale goes that Ewan was the only son and heir of the 5th chief of the MacLean's family of Lochbuie. I'm trying. And he was married to a daughter of the MacDougall clan of Lorne. Now, his wife was a very greedy, very ambitious woman, and she was constantly nagging Ewan to basically try and get more out of his father, more lands, more livestock, just anything she could get her hands on. Now, in 1538, urged on by his wife, Ewan persisted with his demands to his father, who put his foot down and refused, and tempers began to flare. It was a very strained relationship. Now, Ewan, caught between his wife and his familial responsibilities, his father, his clan, he threatened to take the land by force, but his father called his bluff on it. which led to an armed confrontation between the father and the son and their respective followers. Now, in like the heyday of the clan system, these kinds of like clan disputes were fought out very similar to like a duel, but in a very gentlemanly way, i.e. with an agreed upon time and place. Things like ambushes and raids, they were part of more like generalized fighting, but like inter-clan disputes, it was solved this way. Now, the day before the fight was due to take place, Ewan was seen riding along on his black charger, so black horse, when he then saw a tiny woman wearing all green, singing a really strange little song that he didn't recognise as she was washing a bundle of blood-stained clothes in like a small stream by the side of the road. Now again, if you've seen my video on the banshees, you will know what she is. She was what is considered the Scottish equivalent of the Irish banshee, known as the Little Washerwoman. And again, like the banshee, she appeared as an omen of death, as a warning. Now, Ewan also recognised her instantly to be a fairy, and he knew that generally fairy folk, fairy people, had certain abilities that allowed them to sort of look into the future and predict what was going to happen. So he approached her with due respect, his hat, all that stuff, and asked if she would be prepared to tell him the outcome of the upcoming fight. And the response that she gave him was a warning. And said warning was basically that if he found butter at his breakfast table the following morning without having to ask for it, then he would prevail in the fight. However, if there was no butter and he then had to ask for it to be placed there, that misfortune would follow him into the battle. Now, Ewan kind of paid no real mind to it. I think I read that he basically forgot the warning by the end of the day. So come the following morning, the servant did forget to put butter on his table. So he like reprimanded the servant, and it was only then, when they then brought the butter to his table, that he remembered what the washerwoman had told him. So obviously, while Ewan was somewhat wary of the warning that she'd given, he rallied his followers and led them to the field where the battle was going to take place. I've just realised like the next main part of this makeup goes majoritively over like my mouth and my neck, which is going to make it kind of difficult to talk. So if there's a lot of like jump cuts with the makeup, I do apologise. Now, as Ewan was lining up on the field preparing to face his father and his men, amongst his father's lineup, he recognised his uncle. Now, Ewan's uncle had realised that if Ewan was to be killed during this battle, the lands belonging to his father would be left without an heir, which we could obviously then turn to his advantage. So the battle started, and both sides fought bravely, but in the end, the superior numbers of his father's following started to prevail, and Ewan realised that his forces were starting to fall. So he very recklessly charged into like the thickest of the fight. But in doing so, he left himself fully open to the swing of a claymore at like shoulder height, wielded by one of his uncle's men, which completely severed his head. Now, whilst poor Ewan had been beheaded, his body was still like caught up in the stirrups and saddle of his horse, which was now completely frantic and just bolted from the fight. And it followed the course of this river for like miles until it eventually collapsed, just completely exhausted. The tale then goes that his men did eventually find his body and were able to give him like a burial, but the precise location of where he was buried is for the most part kind of lost through the generations. It was obviously not a particularly well signposted grave, because I think they just buried him kind of at the side of the road where the horse had dropped. But I did read one story of someone who grew up hearing these stories as a boy, and he managed to make contact with one of the few like descendants from these clans who the knowledge of where this burial was had been like passed down through generations. So he was able to kind of find it and like leave little markers and stuff, but that in itself has kind of become like its own little sort of localized legend as to the burial site of this man. Now, with regards to his ghost, the belief was that his ghost would haunt the roads of the town and the village and the lands, and that hearing or seeing this particular Headless Horseman was an omen of death only within the MacLean clan, or that the Headless Horseman would ride out to harvest the souls of the clan, as they were the ones who'd killed him. In that respect, Ewan's story, he's kind of like a cross between a Headless Horseman and a banshee, because he's like tied to one specific family. I actually found reference to another story from like a little bit later on, where basically a member of the McLean clan, but specifically on the uncle's side, obviously bearing in mind it was the uncle's men who had killed him, was walking along the road at dusk when he was attacked by the Headless Horseman. Now, he managed to fend off the ghost with a weapon in one hand, and the other hand he managed to stand his ground by holding on to these young tree saplings. But the struggle went on until sunrise, until the Headless Horseman had to retire back to the shadows, leaving the man exhausted but safe beside the saplings, which he'd almost torn them out by the root during the struggle. And it was said that after this struggle, those two tree saplings grew almost horizontally along the ground ever since. I tried really hard to find any kind of reference photos of these particular trees, because I read a first-hand account of someone who saw them and like grew up around them, because he said that one of them had been taken down where they'd like paved new roads, but there was still one tree that was standing horizontally still. If you know of these two horizontal trees, or you have ever seen them or anything like that, please let me know, because I tried so hard to find a photo of them. Now, if you go down from Scotland and into Wales, I couldn't find too much information about them, but there are references and there are said to be tales of Headless Horsemen and Headless Horsewomen throughout Welsh folklore. The one sort of like notable example that I did found was about a place called Bryn Hall in a town that I am not even going to try and pronounce this one, because, well, can someone please tell me how that is pronounced? But anyway, according to local legend, Bryn Hall was once haunted by a Headless Horseman, until one of the hall's servants like deciphered a message from the horseman which identified the location of a buried body, and it would turn out that said body was the body of an illegitimate child fathered by the lord of the hall. Whilst I couldn't find too much about that tale or anything else in Welsh folklore, I did find many a tale in English folklore. Now, as we've seen before, a lot of the differences in tale and story seem to be very much based on sort of localised legends. The one that I saw referenced the most, which I'm going to be honest straight off the bat, I don't think it counts. It's to do with an old legend from the time of King Arthur, or at least from the time set within what's called Arthurian legend, because obviously King Arthur, Camelot, Knights of the Round Table, not a real thing, but they have their own folklore and kind of history with that. But it was to do with a particular legend known as, I'm going to try and say it right, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Now, the general premise is that it was New Year's Eve in Camelot. King Arthur and his court, they were all celebrating and exchanging gifts. Then a gigantic figure who was completely green and riding a green horse just suddenly appeared. I'm not gonna lie, I did picture the jolly green giant, you know, the sweet corn guy. That I couldn't get that out of my head. But basically, this guy has no armour, he only has an axe. He refuses to fight anyone there on the grounds that they are all too weak, apparently. But he insists that he has instead come for a friendly Christmas game, which is for someone to strike him once, and only once, on the condition that the Green Knight may return the blow in exactly a year and a day, and the axe would belong to whoever accepted that deal. You know, a classic Christmas game. Now, King Arthur is actually about to accept the deal himself when one of his youngest knights, who also happened to be his nephew, I think, steps forward. So the giant leans forward and basically presents his neck to Sir Gawain with the axe, who just beheads him in one swing. But the knight does not fall or falter or stumble. He simply stands back up, picks up his severed head, and turns to leave. But before he does leave, he turns around and reminds the knight of their meeting at a place called Green Chapel in a year and a day. Now, that's actually the only part of the story that kind of really has any reference to a Headless Horseman, because the rest of the story is all to do with chivalry and romance, and it's honestly just kind of dull. The rest of the story is basically, it turns out this big green headless giant was actually the lord of a castle who had been transformed by magic, and the whole thing was an elaborate trick by the sorceress Morgan Le Fay, who was King Arthur's stepsister. And she was basically doing the whole thing as just this really elaborate way of testing King Arthur's knights. Side note, Morgan Le Fay, the super powerful, like, enchantress, she is interesting as hell. I did find a small number of references and stories that the Headless Horseman was included in a list of creatures that supposedly roam Dartmoor, which, if you don't know, is an area in Devon in England known for its moorlands and its national park status. But it is also known for having a really rich history of its own myths and legends. I think there's a general consensus that there's a load of, like, gases that are produced on the moorlands, and basically it, like, makes people hallucinate and see things and that kind of thing. If I remember correctly, The Hound of the Baskervilles, the Sherlock Holmes novel, that was set on the moors in Dartmoor. I could genuinely do an entire episode on just Dartmoor and the history of the legends and myths. Like, I know, for example, it's believed that pixies live there and roam there. But yes, many references to a headless horseman who roams the moors. Speaking of moors, I also found a really interesting tale about the headless horseman of the Staffordshire moors, which has had, like, multiple recorded sightings for centuries. Now, with the headless horseman of the Staffordshire moor, some believe that it's an evil spirit that was cast out of heaven and forced to wander the moors, whilst others believe it was a murderer who was beheaded for his crimes and now continually searches for either his head or his executioner. Generally, like, the origins of the legend have been lost over time, but one of the most accepted sort of early stories of this headless horseman involves a farmer who, while he was returning home, really tired and muddled with beer, saw a rider a little ways ahead of him. So he thought it was his neighbour, so he went up to begin asking him if he could have a lift home, only to realise that it was in fact a headless horseman who grabbed him and just took off. And the farmer was, like, just trying to cling on for dear life while the rider and the horse just went full pelt, sparks coming off the hooves, hitting the ground, he's flying all over the place. After what felt like an hour, he is eventually basically dumped outside his house, or not far from his home. Now, the farmer after this was, like, so badly beaten and bruised from this ordeal, this journey, that his wife had to, like, take him in and put him straight to bed. Obviously, everyone asked, like, what happened? He told them the story, and everyone just kind of laughed at him and said he was a bit of a madman and he was a drunk. But then he would then end up dying a few days later from his injuries. Another tale shortly after this involved a woman and her husband, who was also a farmer, who were riding home on their horse along with their dog when a horseman appeared and sort of fell into step with them. Now, the couple's horse started, like, shaking and getting really agitated, and the dog started howling. Now, the husband looked over and realised that the rider did not have a head, so he tried to sort of motion to his wife about it, but she couldn't see him. Only the husband could see the rider. So, not wanting to scare his wife, he kind of just kept still. Later on that night, he was tossing and turning and he was worrying about it, and he eventually told her what he saw, because it was believed that the horseman was an omen of evil to whoever saw it. So, naturally, both the farmer and his wife were really worried. The following day, the horse that they had been riding on died very suddenly, and then shortly after that, their dog got really sick and then also died. These two stories followed quick succession, which rallied the town people to, well, maybe the first guy was actually telling the truth. Okay, I think this part of the illusion is maybe starting to come together now. Now, however many years later, in October of 1880, the legend of the Headless Horseman in this area was written in the local newspaper called The Sentinel. I think it's actually still going, and basically explaining how it was like a common story to tell around the fire during winter, but the highway robbers had used this story to their advantage, you know, wearing sort of ghostly disguises and in some cases working together to play on this legend in order to then rob people. Now, according to this report, they actually called on a church to help sort of lay the demon to rest as such. And I managed to find like an extract from that article which said, and I quote, "Some clergymen were called in to read the prayers that were provided to prevent this goblin from troubling the neighbourhood anymore. But the spirit confessed to these holy men, when they forced it into speech, that it was one of 4 evil spirits cast out of heaven and condemned to roam over the face of the earth till the crack of doom should release it from its terrestrial wanderings. Now, see, it's interesting because horsemen for evil spirits, crack of doom, some people have interpreted that to be in reference to the four horsemen of the apocalypse as written about in the Bible. But obviously the Bible does also reference like fallen angels and spirits being cast out of heaven, not specifically just the horsemen, so it's kind of open to interpretation in that respect. I need to try and do some line work directly over my mouth, which I absolutely will not be able to talk through, so be right back. So I know that was quite a bit of a jump, sort of progress-wise, but I think if I had tried to do any of this detailing whilst talking, it wouldn't have happened. So I'm very sorry for not being able to include any of the details, like the footage of this bit, but I think we're getting there. Now, going back to the Headless Horseman of the Staffordshire Moors, I spoke about obviously the odd stories, the article that was published in the newspaper, and the clergymen that were brought in to try and lay the demon to rest. Now, in the 1920s, a local journalist in the area decided to actually try and track down the horseman. And it wasn't just him either, like a number of members from like a local youth labour group got involved in the hunt as well. And then 1933, two separate groups decided they were going to go out and hunt for this horseman. Now, the first group failed for a very simple reason, in that they got the date wrong. So it was believed that the horseman would only appear on May 18th, which was thought to be the day that he had died. But this first group turned up a week early, so nada. Now, the second group, they did turn up on time, but by that point, their plans to go out hunting the horseman had become so well known that it attracted a really big number of locals and strangers and just loads of other people, and the whole spirit chase was described as basically being turned into almost like a carnival. Now, according to another paper that published an article about the night of this spirit chase, whilst the group saw nothing during that night while they were there, as they were walking home in the early hours of the morning, the sound of horses' hooves could be heard coming in from the mist over the moors. I don't know if you know too much about like moorlands and just moors in general, because they're really creepy. It would not surprise me at all to hear horror stories and tales of like things lurking in the mists on the moors and in the bogs and swamps. It's just, ugh. I don't know, there's something really unnerving about them to me. I mean, I say that when I look like this right now. Another area that I found a lot of references to tales of Headless Horsemen was actually Germany, and some of the oldest associations to the Headless Horseman do in fact come from Germany, with again many of the accounts going back centuries. Now, within German folklore, it is very commonly believed that if anyone is guilty of a crime where the punishment is to be beheaded, if they manage to escape that punishment during their lifetime, then they will be condemned after death to wander the earth forever with their head under their arm. Now, there is a tale of a man whose name I will try and pronounce, called Hans Jägenteufel. Now, this dates back to the 1600s, and it begins with a woman who goes out to a wooded area to collect acorns. Now, while she's collecting these acorns, she hears the sound of a hunting horn being blown, and then shortly after that there's a really loud like falling sound, like the sound a tree would make had it been cut down. She gets a bit spooked by this, so she hides her acorns in the grass. She then hears a second horn sound, and she turns around to see a headless rider wearing a grey cloak sitting on the top of a horse. Now, the rider didn't interact with her, he just rode past her. I don't know if she was also hiding in the grass or what, but she eventually sort of regained her courage and composure. She collected her acorns and went off on her way without any further incident. The woman then returns 9 days later to collect more acorns, and this time she hears a voice who asks her, basically, has no one punished you for taking these acorns? To which she replies that no, she hasn't been punished. The foresters are very kind to her because she's poor. She then turns around and sees that it is the horseman, except he's not on his horse this time. He stood there holding his own head. And he basically just reminds her that she would do well to remember to pray to God to ask for forgiveness, as he never did. He then goes on to basically tell her his life story and how he'd been alive about 130 years prior to this, and his father had tried to teach him not to be too hard on people who were less fortunate, you know, people like her who were poor. But he didn't listen to his father and spent his time drinking and just doing all manner of wicked things, and as a result he was now condemned to wander the world as an evil spirit. There's variations in the story, again depending on location. So in other areas of Germany, specifically around like the Rhineland, rather than using decapitation, the Headless Horseman in this area supposedly killed people simply by touching them, and they were believed to be revenants who had to wander the earth until they had atoned for their sins. Small side note, I looked up what the word revenant actually means because I often get it confused with other things. Basically, a revenant, in the context of folklore at least, is a spirit or a reanimated corpse that is believed to have been revived from the dead in order to haunt the living. And the word is actually derived from the old French word which means returning. Fun little fact for you there. Now, one way that these spirits could atone for their sins was by doing a good deed for a stranger. But instead of obviously showing their gratitude by shaking hands, which would kill the stranger, they would hold a tree branch between them, and the tree branch would then wither and die instead of the stranger. And I saw a few small references to another legend within Germany of a headless horseman who, rather than seeking out souls and killing them, he would warn the living of impending danger, but then also chase down and punish the wicked. So he was kind of a good guy. Now, despite the headless horseman being a figure from mainly European folklore, a lot of people believe it originated in America and that it is an American myth. Now, this is mainly in thanks to the short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, written in 1820 by Washington Irving. Okay, I've just realised the main bits that I have left to do are centred almost entirely on the middle of my throat, which, again, I will not be able to talk while I'm doing it. So let me go and finish this all off, do the little finishing touches, all that lovely stuff, and then we can come back and finish the story. Is the illusion work? Obviously, I've had to adjust my lighting slightly to try and make the illusion work, and illusions like this never usually work too well on camera because, you know, movement. We'll come back to this in a second. So, Washington Irving, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So, whilst Washington was born in America, his parents were actually from the UK. His father was from Scotland and his mother was from Cornwall. A lot of people believe that his parents may have known of the Welsh legends of the Headless Horseman because Wales and Cornwall had very cultural similarities between the two of them. So some people believe that his parents may have picked it up sort of from there. In Irving's novel, the character known as the Headless Horseman is believed to have been a Hessian soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball during the American War of Independence. Hessian soldiers were German soldiers who served under the British Army for many different battles during the 18th century. Irving actually travelled to Germany in 1821 and became very familiar with Dutch and German folklore and was fascinated by it. And a lot of people believe that he took inspiration from German folklore to write the story, while others believe that his inspiration came directly from the Irish legend of the Dullahan or just sort of European folklore in general. Now, while most people would refer to Washington Irving and Sleepy Hollow when talking about the Headless Horseman in America, there is another fairly well-known legend that comes from southern Texas, and it's all stories about a figure known as El Muerto that have circulated since the mid-1800s. So, El Muerto, which is a Spanish term that translates as the dead one, and not to be confused with the luchador wrestler from the Marvel universe, which I didn't know about, so that was an interesting Google search. So it's said to be a headless horseman whose head dangles from the saddle of the horse, and the horse is then said to produce lightning when its hooves hit the ground. There is some belief that this particular iteration of the Headless Horseman is based on yet another legend in which a man was caught stealing horses and the punishment was that he was decapitated. His executioners decided they wanted to make an example of him, so they attached his headless body to a wild horse, attaching it to the saddle, and they attached his head to the pommel of the saddle and let the horse run off, which reminds me a little bit of the tale from Scotland of Ewan, whose horse carried on riding with his body, although this one is, I'd say, somewhat more disturbing. Now, if you go over to Japan, there's actually an urban legend known as the Headless Rider, which is a motorbike rider without a head. Unlike the European Headless Horseman, this is a fairly modern, fairly new myth. It's an urban legend, and the rumours only really started gaining any traction around Japan after the release of a film called Stone in 1974 in Australia, that was then released in Japan in 1981. Now, this film contained a scene in which a rider's head was cut off by a wire stretched across the road, and it's said that this story then spread in connection with the rumours of motorbike accidents that were happening in various parts of the country. The legend itself is said to have originated from an actual accident in which someone who apparently was annoyed with a biker gang is said to have stretched rope across the road as an obstruction, which then caused the riders to crash. There are lots of other theories surrounding this original accident, with many people believing that there was genuinely some kind of like accidental, fatal motorbike crash at some point, but it was then passed on with this sort of very exaggerated story. Other people take a slightly more logical approach and believe that the legend and the story kind of originated from motorcyclists who were wearing dark, full-face helmets on a dark road at night, who was then mistakenly identified as a headless rider. Apparently it's a thing in Japan that some motorbike riders will deliberately wear full-face, dark visor helmets with specialised, like, reduced light reflection on them in order to sort of play up to that legend. Now, the legend itself goes that it was a piano wire stretched across the road, causing a motorcyclist to be decapitated when he collided with it at high speed. However, as we've seen in a number of stories, the bike remained upright with the headless rider still on it. Following this, the rider then became a ghost who would ride down that same road every single night or on the anniversary of their death, searching for their murderer and their missing head. One final side note before we finish everything off: I did find reference to a story from Brazilian folklore regarding something known as the headless mule. Now, the headless part I think is the only connection, but I found it really fascinating, and I wanted to mention it. The legend of the headless mule is to do with a woman who was cursed to transform into a fire-spewing headless mule as punishment for her sins. I ended up reading loads about it, and I was going to go into a bit more detail, but it is a completely separate thing, and to be honest, I'd rather do its own episode because it's really fascinating. Some of the imagery for it is like, it's the body of a mule, and then instead of a head, it's just fire. But yes, I got very sidetracked by that story, but I did make it back to my notes on the Headless Horseman in the end, which is my so well written way of circling to the end. Man, I gotta stop planning this stuff better. The Dullahan specifically is a hell of a lot more, like, evil than I realised, whereas the other iterations of the Headless Horseman in different cultures kind of seems to vary on whether it's evil or not. And I find it interesting that different cultures, it's like a different type of creature, because obviously in Ireland it's unseelie, fairy, fey creature, whereas almost everywhere else it's a ghost. As always, I'm going to ask, have you guys ever had any experiences or know of anyone who has experienced, seen, witnessed, or heard about something to do with a Headless Horseman? And no, the one that goes up and down at Disneyland does not count. Let me know what you guys think of the stories and the legends and the different sort of iterations. If there's anything I've missed, obviously again, let me know. What do we think of the look? This was a challenge for me. I can't lie. I think generally I'm happy with it. The mouth illusion is really tricky to do, and I've never done a neck illusion like that before either, so it's been a learning curve at least. But in case you couldn't tell, I was going for the Dullahan iteration with the big grin in the eyes and the ugh. If I sit like that and squint, then it works. Let me know what you guys think of the Headless Horseman and the Dullahan. Let me know what you think of the look. Let me know who or what else you want me to cover in any future videos. Otherwise, I hope you all have a fabulous day. I don't think I have any other closing notes, or if I have, I've forgotten them. So I hope you are all having a wonderfully spooky October, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.